So welcome everybody to Making Room, planning for those who are here and those on their way to the Connecticut River Valley. This is the first of three discussions that the Connecticut River Joint Commissions is having about climate migration, but really it could just be about people moving to the region for whatever reason. But there's been a lot of discussion about what's going to be happening as sea level rises and it inundates more both in terms of surface water and groundwater or coastal communities, or as people in other parts of the country that become either less inhabitable or less more uncomfortable to live there, begin to look to the Northeast, because it's been our region, the Connecticut River Valley, has been identified as a good destination, a good climate destination, as our climate continues to change. Go to the next slide. So what is the Connecticut River Joint Commissions? It was created in 1989 through the legislatures of both New Hampshire and Vermont in a mission to preserve and protect the visual and ecological integrity and sustainable working landscape of the Connecticut River Valley, and to guide its growth and development through grassroots leadership. We're really proud of the over 150 citizen volunteers that they either serve as commissioners from New Hampshire or Vermont to the Connecticut River Joint Commissions, or represent one of the towns on the local river subcommittees. And I'll just note the commissioners, with a couple of exceptions, are appointed by the governors of New Hampshire and Vermont, and the local river subcommittee members are appointed by their municipalities. Go to the next slide. And so this is just a quick overview of the Bi-State Discussion Series. We're doing this in collaboration with Antioch University, New England, Antioch University, New England, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Upper Valley Adaptation Work Group, and the City of Keene. So today is the overview of the situation. On the 29th, there's going to be an in-person meeting at 11 in New Hampshire, a World Cafe discussion that's going to be led, I believe, by Antioch University, New England. Then we're going to have another webinar on April 20th on programs, funding, and case studies. And then there'll be an in-person meeting of the Climate Migration Conference and discussing local solutions. Next slide. And so the guest today, I'm Chris Camping. I'm Executive Director of the Windham Regional Commission in Southeast Vermont, and I chair the Vermont half of the Connecticut River Joint Commissions. And many thanks to Olivia Oizue, who was with Connecticut. She's a senior planner with Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Commission, and provides incredible support through that entity to the Connecticut River Joint. Without her and without Andrea, what's happening right now would not be possible. And we're thrilled to be joined by Bronwyn Cook, who is the planning and policy manager for the Agency of Commerce and Community Development in Vermont, and Ben Frost, who is the Deputy Executive Director of New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. Next slide. Oh, then we're going to this is going to be followed by a curated discussion led by Marie Caduto and Jason Rasmussen. Marie is with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and Jason Rasmussen is the Executive Director of the Mount Scottney Regional Commission in Vermont. Next slide, sorry. Andrea Cass is going to lead the quick identification of who's here with us today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, our first question is, we just want to get to know who's in the room today. So if you want to answer our questions, I believe our poll is going. Can everyone see the, I'm seeing we're getting some responses, so I'll give it another minute or so. Where you're coming from, who you're joining us as. Seeing we're getting quite a few responses. Can everyone see those results? Yeah, so it looks like we got a lot of people from New Hampshire and Vermont, a wide range of people who are joining us, both residents, state staff, local volunteers, elected officials. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Next slide. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to ask that everyone stay muted, please. And we encourage you to use the chat to share any comments or questions as they come up. And Marie and Jason will be compiling all of those and sharing that input throughout the discussion at the end. Next slide.
So I think I'm going to take this first kind of section here, talking about lay a little bit of groundwork around what is climate migration, how do we define that, and then moving a little bit into the more the scientific research about climate change risks, migration, and what it means for the Connecticut River Valley or Upper Connecticut River watershed. I'll be using both those terms interchangeably. So talking first about what is climate migration, planning to place some guideposts on this topic. As Chris already introduced, it's a term, we're using the term climate migration today, but there are others used with similar but not always the same meaning, including climate refugees or climate displacement. And these variety of titles are also reflected in definitions of those top titles. But also in the experiences of people. So for example, a professor with Portland State University defines climate migration as the voluntary or forced displacement of communities due to a climate-induced stressor. While staff with Smart Growth America explain it as the movement of people, development and investment to areas that are less susceptible to environmental hazards. Now, a few key dynamics that I want to point out in these names and definitions. Largely, they all include some reference to a climate or natural hazard as the main factor that threatens life or property. Other related factors might come up, including access to electricity, insurance costs, and any impacts around quality of life or affordability. Most often, the migration that people see and that academics and researchers point to is movement that happens within countries is the most common. And that movement can come with those personal assets, but also the movement of larger investments. The movement can also be forced, but it can also be voluntary. And usually there's a combination of choice and need at play. And these are terms often used by academics, planners such as myself, and they're not often, at least as of yet, used for self-identification. So Americans have dealt with climate disaster before. The first that comes to my mind is the Dust Bowl in the early 1900s, when settlers in the prairies with thin topsoils converted those to intensive crops like corn, which brought drought, a plunge in crop yields and incomes, and dust storms, some taller than skyscrapers. And this led to the migration of 2.5 million people, mostly to the west. This map here is showing kind of a historical diagram of where those flows went. And those people became newcomers, and they settled in communities. They sometimes competed for jobs. And states and places reacted to this differently. Colorado tried to seal its border. California funneled people into shanty towns in some places. And only after migrants had settled and after many years were some towns able to bounce back and sometimes stronger. Places that migrants left, there is evidence that they did not fully recover. Other historical examples indicate reflect that tendency for people to stay within their home region, kind of these migration regions when displaced by disasters. And we saw this happen around Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, and the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And there's less documentation on the equity front, but there is, all of these examples and others show typically inequity around a lack of appropriate infrastructure. And I think this was especially stark in the Hurricane Katrina incidents. And these disproportionate impacts, they do play out in the place that's hit, but then also, as you know, pulling back to the Dust Bowl, affects where those people are going and being prepared to respond. I want to take a moment to talk about some of the big ticket items expected to see for climate change across the US. This is coming from the 2018 National Climate Assessment. It's based on historical data and projection data. And generally, the upward arrows are indicating increasing trends, the downward arrows decreasing trends. This is a national average, and bidirectional, you know, like the drought conditions, there's not a definitive trend. So just to give a brief run through on these, generally temperatures and heat waves are increasing. The growing season is becoming longer. Rainfall is becoming more intense. More days will be seen over 65 degrees where things like air conditioning are needed. And these are what are called cooling degree days. And so that's a proxy for that kind of energy demand. So that cooling degree day is where the AC is needed. On the flip side, there are fewer days expected where heating is needed, called heating degree days. On drought conditions, although they do not show a definitive trend, New England is expected to see an increase, especially of things called flash droughts. Wildfires are increasing, again, mostly in the West, but smaller ones in New England. Snowpack and sea ice extent decreasing, despite our snow today. Sea level is increasing, and oceans are acidifying. Oceans do acidify roughly a quarter of emitted greenhouse gases. And the last one is that marine species are moving to deeper and more northern waters, including species along the northeast coast. Now, zooming in to the Connecticut River Valley and the risk factors most impacting us here, because when we think about climate migration, we also have to think about our own, this place's resiliency to those same effects. Extreme rainfall being our highest risk category, followed by hurricanes, medium to high. This is at a county level, ranking risk at a county level. So some, mostly the northern counties are medium, southern counties higher. For hurricanes, water stress ranges low to medium, and heat stress at low. So this is an example of kind of one of these maps. This is extreme rainfall and how that risk distributes across the country. You can see that the Connecticut River Valley lights up in orange across the board, which is the high category. Now there are some resiliency potential upsides. Just take the growing season. This graph is on historical data coming from the 2014 climate change report for southern New Hampshire. So this is a trend we're already seeing and we're expecting we will continue to see. Our planet's history is 4.5 billion years, but humans have been flourishing for only the last 6 millennia. And this represents a type of temperature niche to some extent, main drivers most scientists agree on, where mean annual temperature is in the 50s, where humans tend to flourish. This map is focusing in on that temperature indicator and relates it to a kind of suitability and how that suitability might change under one of the projected scenarios, specifically the RCP 8.5 scenario used by the International Panel on Climate Change. This is the business as usual scenario. It's a very high greenhouse gas emitting scenario. It's not necessarily the most probable, but it is often used in a lot of the maps you'll see throughout this in the research and in the presentation today. Now the models can be challenging in terms of being precise or accurate, but they are useful in seeing trends at a course level and getting some messaging and planning in place. In general, here you're seeing a northward possible trend if you think about what this means for migration. A lot of areas in the south, globally, you have generally more reddish yellow colors where you have a larger strip in the north. And so that northern trend is what I wanted to highlight. This research paper also pointed out that by 2070, in this scenario, near 3 billion people could be living in near unlivable conditions from a temperature standpoint. And that means an average temperature beyond 84 degrees Fahrenheit. A New York Times article kind of painted the picture nicely with mention to this place, our place, by saying once chilly places like Minnesota and Michigan and Vermont will become more temperate, more verdant, and inviting. The migration system is a socio-environmental system, and it is partly defined by the ties between places. Now, I'm trying to harken back to most migration happens within a country and even within a region of a country before it goes elsewhere. You go to places where you're connected. When part of that connected system experiences a disturbance event, the out-migration impacts all communities as people redistribute. And generally, you see there's the Northeast, New England, there is an interconnected system in that place. So sea level rise is likely to be of particular impact around for New England and for this part of the watershed. 40% of the population of the US lives in coastal areas, including Northeast population centers of New York and Boston. A new fact to me, the Hudson River is part of an estuary that feels the ocean's tide 153 miles upstream, extending these impacts to more inland communities. And so the research paper here also used that business as usual scenario, and it estimated potential number of extra migrants outside of baseline that you might see in counties relative to that county's population. And so the counties in the Connecticut River Valley are kind of in the softer pink. So that's a 1 to 6% increase. And again, a lot of this modeling it's a lot about the messaging. And there's a lot of factors that are going to play out in terms of where people go, including employment opportunities, the means to move, and the actions taken in those by the people who already are there.
Olivia, can I add one thing there on that slide?
Yeah.
So one thing to think about, oftentimes we think about, you hear a lot about like sunny day flooding in coastal communities, right? You're related to just natural tidal variations, and then we have, worse nor'easters, worse flooding during nor'easters when that coincides with those lunar tide events. So that's the stuff we hear a lot about. What we hear less about is that with sea level rise, you're also going to have more saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers that are coastal. When with that ground level rise, you're also going to see potentially, if you think about how many industrial sites, especially in the Northeast, exist along coastal areas and rivers, and that you're also, with that groundwater rise, you may also have more industrial contamination, because we've done a lot of work with brownfields, right, in these areas to try to help cap them and isolate those hazards. But if the water table itself rises, that's going to create another problem. There was a really good story a few years ago by National Public Radio. I'm sure if you Google sea level induced groundwater rise, you'll probably find the research. And the reason why what's interesting about the Hudson River estuary is you don't really think about, that's basically a fjord, and there's a lot of industrial development there. And Troy that's as tidal as far north as Troy. At that point, you drive through Troy if you're going from New York into Vermont, you drive through Troy to get to Bennington, and so that there are going to be effects where we're not necessarily thinking about it. And then if you also think about where passenger rail lines run, including in the Hudson River Valley, we're talking a lot of, not just industrial displacement, but also a lot of, transportation displacement and a lot of industrial uses, both current and historic, being impacted, which could have a significant number of environmental impacts. So just wanted to throw that out there, that it's more than just people's homes getting flooded. There's a really complex hydrologic web there that impacts how we live in these areas where we're going to see sea level rise.
Thanks for adding those insights, Chris. I want to take a moment to look at the broader resilience of communities in addition to their risk. This is the US EPA Climate Resilience Screening Index. It's a conceptual roadmap that factors in influences of county and community vulnerability and recoverability to different types of disasters, and takes on 27 indicators that touch on 5 different domains: the natural environment, condition of ecosystems, society, such as demographics, public health, also condition of trade services, which I thought stood out to me, especially considering a lot of conversation today about the current housing crisis and concern for a lack of sufficient trade services. Built environment, infrastructure is another category, as well as governance, specifically the collaboration among government, nonprofit, private, and of course then risk to different climatic events. Again, the Connecticut River Valley and New England lights up with darker blue colors, as well as other areas in northern New York and around the Great Lakes and more out west. Notable to me is the higher prevalence of lighter colors as you move east across the country, which could indicate the greater likelihood of bottlenecks or experience of being overwhelmed. Now, so far we've talked a lot about that forced migration, when folks feel their safety, financial, or infrastructure requires them to move, as well as the institutions along with that. Another type of migration is more voluntary, or perhaps represents a family with the resources to do some advanced preparation. These types of migrants can be called amenity migrants, affinity. Generally, they might be called the gentrifying leading edge. Not just related to climate migration, but definitely a part of climate migration. The figure here is a theoretical model for this type of migration in communities for the Alps. It's a different community, but the dynamics do resonate with how we already see amenity migration in this area, where we have rich amenities for the outdoors, recreation, a sense of rurality, and that might align with some as a lifestyle preference. And the figure highlights how amenity migrants resettle in regions in which they have relationships, settling near friends or family who are already local residents. They may be seasonal workers or second homeowners where they gradually build personal networks and a sense of belonging, and that can reduce barriers to a future or more permanent move. Sorry about that. And then while the direction of these flows are both in and out, with climate migration, there's the potential where the inflow might be greater than the out. And so we saw some of these dynamics, especially heightened in the COVID-19 pandemic, where second homeowners moved in permanently or semi-permanently, we're not yet sure to what extent, and also buying up more of the housing stock, driving up, at this point where we have a shortage, driving up prices that we all saw during that time, which is part of why that's called the gentrifying leading edge. So these populations with capital resources can invest and possibly create tension with existing residents. Now, to some extent, you might think this is all hypothetical, but there are early indicators in the Connecticut River Valley. News stories are popping up both locally and nationally, pointing often to all or part of this watershed, parts of this watershed. These are just a few examples, local and national. Data is also showing some alignment with these concepts and trends too. New Hampshire Regional Planning Commissions put out a realtor survey as part of their regional housing needs assessment. Realtors identified out-of-state buyers and where they were geographically located. And this table is showing the percentage of realtors who indicated certain places. Those in yellow are top outflow states due to climate impacts. And I've highlighted here especially California and Texas as ones outside of the Northeast with significant percentages. California in the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee region, for realtors primarily in this region, that percentage was even higher. And just looking at the top for a second, Massachusetts, 67%. Just want to zoom into that. Massachusetts population declined during the pandemic. Suffolk County, which is mostly Boston, lost more than 20,000 people. And this map is showing where they went from 1 to 10. The first being Portland, Maine, and the second being Lebanon, New Hampshire. And while we want to be careful not to draw too much from conditions during the pandemic, it is reasonable to think that for those who do not stay, they might go back to Suffolk County in Massachusetts. They may choose this place again when another shock happens. Now, thinking about our watershed, the Upper Connecticut River watershed, and this potential for migration and the climate impacts, we have to think about the health of our collective watershed. And for her, we are collective stewards that we seek to sustain and nourish and to protect our natural resources, our communities, and ourselves. And the stressors and responses faced in one community of the 93 New Hampshire communities and 114 Vermont communities in this watershed, in this part of the watershed, they don't happen in a contained system. The watershed follows natural interactions more closely than political boundaries. And so we are impacted in our regional and watershed community. I don't think anyone here needs to be told that change is hard. We all know that. But opportunity does exist among these dynamics. Receiving communities, or more glamorously named climate destinations or climate havens, can benefit from economic, social, and cultural contributions the new residents bring. This map gives us a glimpse at economic opportunity. Again, using that business as usual scenario for annual damage in the latter part of the century, 2080 to 2100. Negative damage means economic benefit, and that's highlighted in green. And you can see Connecticut, this part of the country is green. So the risks, although that there are risks and related fears that happen when we think about this change, and that is our human condition. And at one point, our response to that was to run or to protect. Our response in this scenario may be best to plan and to implement actions early. And so facing this change through effective planning allows for the greatest potential opportunity for the residents here now. We do have a lot of history and tradition of people living in this place and to learn from and to be in conversation with. The valley has been sustaining humans since the Ice Age, 13,000 years ago. We have a rural economy that's local and regional. Our river especially has overcome challenges in the past. And the intact village and downtowns that are still there from early European settlers provide some foundation for resilience that we can be grateful for and seek to protect and build on. And all this talk is great, but human psychology, unfortunately, I tried to find a bright side. It's not on our side for long-term planning. I'm very discouraged by this personally, but we're not really great at it. And I just want to read this quote really quick. This is information. I really like the Hidden Brain podcast with NPR for anybody who listens to that. So this is from 2 of those episodes. And one, so this quote, I just want to read it. It says, "In the conventional telling, someone raises an alarm and everyone jumps and does something about it. In reality, warnings are likely to be heard when they are made by someone in our in-group. When the warning is so imminent, everyone can see the danger, and the solution does not require a radical shift in existing strategy. Unsurprisingly, this means many warnings will go unheeded." So whilst this psychology makes me nervous, it does give also some practical tools that allow us to, allow response. It does seem like this is more of an art than a science. So I'm jealous of all the artists out there. It's a type of social wisdom that will help us to be flexible in our outreach and communication, but also be persistent when it's needed. Some specific dynamics that I want to call out are solution aversion, and that relates to the effect when if somebody doesn't like a solution, that person may often reject not just solution, but deny the problem to begin with. Another one is commitment bias, which happens when someone commits to a particular strategy and then they don't want to back out. All that work can't have been for nothing. And I think both of those we see happen regularly in our communities, and figuring out how we communicate and interact to move things forward is a challenge and art. As part of a student project with Antioch University in 2021, there was a potential framework for CRJC to approach climate migration planning. I'm not going to go through each of these. We'll be sharing out the slides later, but I just wanted to kind of bring these concepts that we'll be carrying through the rest of today. Briefly, biophilia, smart growth, having a welcoming standard, and equitable climate preparedness. I do want to add that to this, which is an element of time. We don't necessarily have the luxury, especially in something with the nature of climate change, to do things perfectly. And so rather, I think we have to seek to just do our best with some time constraints, and keeping that in mind when making our plans. Passing it off to Chris to dive a little bit more into an overview of the planning.
Olivia, that was an excellent introduction. Thank you so much. And we're going to be probably kicking back and forth a little bit here on this part of the presentation. So just going to talk a bit about local governance, land use, housing, and infrastructure, and how those things relate to each other. Go to the next slide. And so in Vermont and New Hampshire, I just gave a presentation to another group on governance and planning structure. And one of the challenges that we have, and I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's something we need to recognize and own it and figure out how to work within the system, is there are state level policies, but a lot of the state level policies rely upon local action. And that means and by local action, we mean action by municipalities. And that requires they have both, and I refer to it as the political and operational capacity to actually act. And oftentimes, our work at a regional commission is helping a community decide like whether or not to even have a conversation about an issue in the first place, much less moving on to the planning phase. And then once a municipality actually develops a plan, then it actually has to be implemented, right, to take effect and to implement policy. And that's another choice they have to make, and it may require investment of funds. Or do they actually have the capacity to pursue funds? Or do they have the desire to implement zoning? Or whether it's regulatory or non-regulatory, what's their ability to move on that? And so it's important to understand that towns can choose to have a plan, to choose to follow state planning goals, to adopt zoning, and I would also include that flood hazard administration, or otherwise implement plans, and to engage in state regulatory frameworks. In Vermont, a town can choose whether to engage in an Act 250 application. That's the state Vermont state land use regulation process, or Section 248, which is the energy generation or transmission process. And the other challenge that we face in Vermont and New Hampshire, not saying county government good, county government bad, but we do lack a county government which has the ability to aggregate taxes in between the local level and the state level. And the challenge that creates for our states is that in places with county government, whether, again, not saying it's good or bad, but it's something we need to recognize, when you have that ability to aggregate public funds in between the municipal level and the state level, then you can better implement at that political subdivision's discretion, at voters' discretion, implementation of projects that transcend municipal boundaries, or that, investing funding in a particularly important municipal project that has importance for the county as a whole. We don't have that, and we just need to recognize that that's a challenge. And then a lot of federal programs are generally not designed with Vermont or New Hampshire in mind. They tend to assume the existence of county government. This became an issue on the distribution of ARPA funds, American Rescue Plan Act funds. And then when at the federal level, just so you understand, in New England and Vermont and New Hampshire, we talk about regions. Oftentimes we're talking about something at the county scale, or maybe a county plus a few more towns. At the federal level, when they talk about regional, they're talking about multiple counties engaging with one another that oftentimes will even transcend state lines. Go to the next slide. And so there's this balancing act, right? And so you may have a statewide policy, like whether it's related to housing or energy or climate action or land conservation, water quality, working lands preservation, working forest, forest products industry support, dairy industry support, whatever that may be. But then you also have a lot of decisions that have to get made at the local level. And we have these very, very small units of government that, especially, and we're seeing this a lot, I assume it's the case in New Hampshire, but in Vermont, with decision-making around the use of all of this federal funding that's now available, not only the funding that went directly to the towns, a number of our towns are still deliberating on how to use their ARPA funding, but but their capacity to actually apply for and use funding that's coming through the state governments, or funding that will be coming through the federal government related to the like the inflation, the IRA and the IIJA, and now spacing on what they are is beyond the acronym Inflation Reduction Act and the I think it's now called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, but also doing all the underlying planning work that has to be done in order to make state policy become a reality. And we're asking a lot of our towns, to plan for and develop proposals around major infrastructure investment when they don't have a tradition of having done that, at least not for generations. A number of our towns, they're really good at talking about bridges and culverts and replacing those, or dump trucks, road equipment. But when it comes to like deciding whether or not to invest in the infrastructure to both address current village water quality and wastewater disposal needs, and also the ability to do infill development there, or potentially like expand housing or other things kind of on the edges of that village, that's a really hard conversation to have. And also what you wind up with, because there's so much deference to municipalities to plan and to act. This has equity and justice implications, because basically what you wind up with is a patchwork quilt of those communities that are able to act on these things or choose to act, and those that don't. And with regard to like being able to pursue state and federal funding, I refer to this kind of as the Hunger Games approach, and that those who kind of have the capacity to pursue these things, those resources for their needs, will, and those that don't won't. And again, it further exacerbates the the opportunities that communities can pursue in the interest of their residents. Next. And so land use, it is really, again, I just gave another presentation on this. I'm trying to remember exactly what I told you guys and what I told them. But yeah, it's the distributed nature of planning decisions in Vermont, New Hampshire can make land use achieving larger statewide policies difficult. And so in New England, again, I already mentioned about the Asheville County government. Municipal decision-making capacity and ability to act on preventing development in high-risk areas, especially in our flood hazard and areas and areas with fluvial erosion risks. And fluvial erosion, that's what happens when the ground literally washes away and whatever sits on top of it washes away too. I know in our experience, at least, it's really difficult for communities to have conversations about precluding development in lands that we already know are at risk. They may have already flooded, and the science and physics has identified what is happening, what's going to happen. But it's really difficult for towns to have those conversations. Oftentimes, at least in our region, too, a number of towns will adopt flood hazard bylaws so that the residents can have access to the National Flood Insurance Program. But then administering those flood hazard bylaws is really difficult. We need to make existing settlements more flood resilient while improving upstream and downstream floodwater attenuation. And that's a fancy way of saying we need to figure out how to do a better job of improving access to the floodplain of rivers and streams. That can be, again, something really challenging for local governments to do. And another thing that I'll just note, I believe it's the case that in a lot of areas where you attenuate floodwaters, those are also opportunities to recharge our aquifers. Olivia made a great point about we're going to see more droughtiness in the spring and summers, and what potentially wetter events may have wetter falls and winters. It's really hard sometimes to get our heads around, drought resilience in New England, but we're seeing it, right? We've seen it recently. The default settlement pattern really is dispersed, meaning, large lot single-family home development, especially on rural roads. And that dispersed pattern is going to make it difficult to achieve greenhouse gas emission strategies and also adaptation and resilience strategies. And increased clearing and creation of more impervious surfaces is going to change stormwater dynamics. Next. Housing is we already know this is a problem. And some of the things that I've written about, we've seen that in our region, it doesn't take many people moving in to have an impact on both the quantity of housing and the price, right? A supply and demand. And this is the case whether you're a renter or an owner. The costs and the percentage of household income for renters has outstripped even that of households who have mortgages who own their homes. And what we're seeing now, we don't have the numbers yet, but we're seeing now, and what we're going to see going into the future is, regardless of the reason why people move here, as more people move in, we're likely to see, unless we get this housing situation figured out, more people moving out because they just will not have the housing choice that they need in order to age in place or to stay here. That we're also likely to see more people living in unsuitable housing situations where, let's say it's a divorce or a domestic issue, people not being able to leave that household. Or an example I use a lot, we have a rapidly aging population, people who are older living isolated in rural area on rural roads that would benefit from being able to live in a village or downtown where they could walk to goods and services. Olivia, anything else you want to add here?
I'll just note that the graphic here is a pulls data from both states centered in the greater Upper Valley. So it's happening, we're experiencing the same crisis right now.
Next slide. We don't talk enough probably about our local food infrastructure and our food security. And I'm going to talk a bit about this, and Olivia will. But we really, part of the charge of the Connecticut River Joint Commissions is relates to the farm and forest economy and working lands. And one of the things that we really need to be mindful of, I think, is we already see what's happening with not just drought, but aridification of the West. But a lot of the areas of the country where we produce food and rely on food, it's not just California, Arizona, even in the Midwest, they're rapidly drawing down what's called the Ogallala Aquifer at an unsustainable rate. And I have a lot of family ties to the Mississippi Delta and Mississippi. And even that area that you would think would be incredibly wet, where the Mississippi River flows and floods, and you have other small rivers flowing and flooding, they are overdrawing the aquifer there in order to produce crops. And so we really need to be mindful about keeping these working lands as farms. And I always argue that the best way to keep farms as farms is to really focus on their economic viability for everybody involved in the food system that work on those farms, as opposed to just conserving the farmland. Conserving the farmland is important, but keeping farms actually economically viable is really critical. Olivia, what would you like to say about this?
Now, I would just add that the pandemic helped to highlight that the importance of having a local food system in being resilient. And there is potential to make shifts in this region and throughout New England. One place that's been doing a lot of thinking about this is the Food Solutions New England, which there is a collective of people in that sector across New England. And they looked at diet and what this region can produce, what might be coming in, continue to come in through a supply chain. And really roughly in this map here of New England, showing where they're more likelihood for pasture or cultivated areas. Largely in the Connecticut River Valley, you're seeing a lot of pasture, harkening back to those dairy farms that are so prevalent in the valley, and maintaining those. And so I think just really thinking about, I think about this as kind of a keeping the farms we have, protecting that land use pattern, and that balanced land use, both in terms of human settlement, but also in terms of the ecosystem services, the natural resource needs that we need to kind of continue that resiliency, support that resiliency into the future.
Great. Next slide. And I think our part's wrapping up here. A critical thing that I raise a lot in our region and in Vermont is no matter what our zoning bylaws and other rules and regulations say, if you don't actually have the infrastructure, the wastewater and water infrastructure to support compact settlement, you're not going to get it. You're not going to be able to do it. And this has implications not only for the well-being of people who already live in our compact settlements. We're talking especially villages here, where these communities grew up around a tradition of use of water that was not nearly as intensive as now, and so we likely have issues there where a septic and well shadowing. So we have existing human health concerns, also surface and groundwater concerns, but also, frankly, just the ability to retain the homes and businesses that already exist, and especially for businesses that may need to increase the intensity of their wastewater use. And that could be something as simple as your country store being able to add tables inside so that they can serve people food inside. But it's going to make housing development at scale really difficult until we as a region, as a bi-state region, really begin making more investment into wastewater and water infrastructure to make not only compact settlement possible, but housing at scale possible. Then we're also going to mention that related to water, these flash droughts are anticipated to become much more common and we're seeing that trend. And Olivia, I don't know if you want to say more about that.
No, I think you spoke to it well, you know, the increase of the droughts and the drying of the wells. So thinking about our infrastructure and land use again, and how, you know, we have innovative strategies and technologies that we might need to consider as we, in both these sectors, you know, both traditional and new systems that facilitate the needs.
Great. Next slide. And I think this is the last slide. And then there's also just the investment in transportation and energy, especially, you know, we need to be thinking about as we move towards more of a future that's electric and not as reliant at all on fossil fuels. How are we going to generate that energy? How are we going to transmit it? But then also the importance of investing in all the transportation, stormwater, wastewater, solid waste, the whole range of infrastructure, not only to maintain what we have, but also in order to accommodate growth into the future. And again, this is another area where it's challenging with this very distributed planning regime that we have. Can be difficult for you know, when you're making decisions at these very small scales, to have more decisions made at kind of an intermunicipal level. And this is where regional planning commissions are really important. A lot of people know the work that we do related to transportation, but there's a lot of discussion that really should be more discussion that needs to be had around energy and wastewater, also and water, aquifer protection, just a whole host of things. And I would argue add to the green infrastructure, being able to maintain it over the long run. And I think, Olivia, does that wraps this up, I think?
Yep, pretty much. Just this one more, and we pass it on.
So what can communities do? Nearly all the measures with respect to climate change in the region are about resiliency and prevention instead of growth. What we really need, we need to engage, especially I would say, more in the current, in the younger generations coming up in the planning discussions, and perhaps are engaged now, having more robust conversations with everybody in the community, especially those on what are called, I was on the Vermont Climate Council. We talk about people on the front lines of climate change and directly involving them in the creation of policies and also implementation strategies. And Olivia, you want to wrap up? Anything else you want to say about that?
I think you covered it. I think we can stop sharing and pass off the baton to Bronwyn Cook.
All right, let me just pull up my slides. All right, can you all see my slides? Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to make what is going to be a very brief presentation. I already love knowing that a lot of what I'm going to talk about has already been mentioned a little bit already in the from Olivia and Chris. So just by way of introduction really quickly, my name is Bronwyn Cook. I'm a community planning and policy manager in the Department of Housing and Community Development for the state of Vermont. It's a mouthful. I have a quick presentation for you here today. Just one more quick thing about my background. I'm relatively new to the world of land use planning. My background is primarily in climate energy planning. I used to work for the city of Cambridge in Massachusetts, working on all of our emissions mitigation work, our climate resilience work. But land use, as you can imagine, is not a very big thing in Cambridge, where it's all very built out already. So I joined the team in Vermont and have sort of switched focus and switched gears a little bit. And I'm working with our team on all of our sort of smart growth programs and policies. So my presentation today, I'm just gonna, as I said, I'll try and make it very brief so that there's some room for conversation and questions afterwards. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about our development pattern in theory, sort of our planning framework, and what the theory behind that is. I'll talk a little bit about our planning in practice, what we're actually seeing on the ground, and then just a couple of notes on some, what I'm calling for now, corrective measures, the things that we're doing to try and better align our policy and planning framework so that we're actually achieving some of the goals that we have. So really quick, what is our development pattern in theory? So in theory, our land use goals are to plan development so as to maintain the historic settlement pattern of our compact village and urban centers separated by rural countryside. So that is Vermont's background in terms of its development pattern, but this isn't just about, historic preservation. It's not just about preserving the way we've always done things. There's a real benefit to this kind of land use and development pattern. So by directing development towards our centers, we are able to support housing choices that are close to jobs, close to amenities, close to educational opportunities. And because those things are closer, it also supports, more pedestrian and bike-friendly ways of getting around. It can save money in terms of, collective and municipal infrastructure, more efficient use of some of that infrastructure. It protects our environment and makes sure that we still have open space, wildlands, agricultural lands. It can reduce pollution from all of those, less transportation use, et cetera. It encourages community engagement, which is certainly something that can help with resilience when disasters do hit. So there's, I could go on, and I think most of the audience here may be familiar with this already, but there's real benefits to this type of land use pattern. The condensed version, the Cliff Notes version of sort of how we got to this kind of land use goal in our planning framework to support it. So the goal is supported by about 100 years worth of planning history, most of which I have not been around for. So I'm just going to give you the sort of condensed version. But zoning was first established in the 1930s. I think most folks here, again, are probably familiar with Dillon rules and what that means. But essentially, the state sort of authorizes local governance to make plans to make regulation around land use. And so that zoning was enabled back in the 1930s. In the 1960s, again, I wasn't around for it, but from all accounts, the way it's described is that we were really seeing a lot of unprecedented growth that we as a state were really unprepared for. And so that's when our land use goal sort of really solidified into that statement that we saw earlier. So in the 1960s, there was pushback on what we were seeing. There was a lot of sort of linear highway strip development, and it was seen as something that was sort of eating away at our, sort of strong village centers and community centers. In the 1960s, the governor established a planning office to sort of better organize and coordinate local planning efforts around managing some of that growth that we were seeing in the 60s. The legislature also created in the mid-60s an interagency committee on natural resources, sort of recognizing that there was this, tie and link between how we use land and being able to protect some of our natural resources. The governor also created what was called the Scenery Preservation Council. So I think that's probably best known for that billboard ban. So, protecting our scenic areas of Vermont. And we also, in the 1960s, passed the Municipal and Regional Planning Act, which required municipalities, if they wanted to regulate, it required them to have a plan in place. In the 1970s, that's when Chris mentioned this briefly, but Act 250, which is, as far as I can tell, both loved and hated, depending on who you talk to in the state. But Act 250 was created. It was essentially the statewide land use planning act, and it developed a set of development review criteria. But as Chris mentioned, not everybody participates in that. In 1988, there was the Coordinated Planning Act, and this created a set of 14 planning goals, and also required coordination between state, regional, and municipal planning entities, and asked and required that they be consistent with achieving those goals, with a not insignificant loophole that if any planning entity could determine that one of the goals wasn't applicable or wasn't achievable, then it didn't necessarily have to be achieved. So that's the brief history. A quick note on population. It was not incidental that I overlaid this on top of our sort of population growth over time. As I mentioned, in the 1960s, we were seeing that growth that was sort of unprecedented and unexpected. And I think we're in a place now where that's what we're talking about right now, is we're in a place where we feel like we might be seeing that growth again. So we're in a new era where, we've heard projections for population in Vermont saying, Vermont's population is likely to decline. On the left, there's a graph from a Washington Post article where some researchers were predicting population decline in Vermont. But as of the last census, what we're seeing is an increase in population. And again, now that we've seen the pandemic, now that we are talking about climate migration, maybe that doesn't seem so surprising, but it's just sort of evidence again that we may be in that, we may be in an era similar to the 60s where we're seeing this growth, and we need to be preparing for it so that we can accommodate the growth in a way that sort of maintains some of the goals that we have at the state. I certainly would hate for planners 5, 10, 20 years from now to be having this same talk and saying, we didn't see that coming and we weren't prepared for it. And we, are now having to do some corrective actions around it. So back to our planning framework, just the last slide on this. This is just to say that our planning framework has a lot of frames. We've got these 14 goals, and we also have these different levels of scale and authority in which these plans can be happening. It's all very well intentioned, but certainly the way it plays out on the ground sometimes can act to maybe stagnate the kind of growth that we want to see. I made a note to myself that Chris is going to talk a little bit more about this, but I think he's all set. So I didn't know, Chris, if you want to add anything to this. I know you have some thoughts around regional planning that you touched on a bit, but just wanted to give you an option to add anything else that you wanted to add on this.
Just briefly, I think one of the challenges that all the regional commissions face is we're grant funded, so we're funded to do what I think this is the case in New Hampshire too. We're funded to do what the legislature deems we should do in a given year. Towns are demanding more and more of us because, frankly, they're struggling. What I'm finding is they're struggling with just basic governance issues. And so the land use planning, the infrastructure planning, they're having difficulty doing that because they're struggling with just basic things like lister services and financial management and basic zoning administration and that kind of thing. And so I think right now in Vermont, I'll get on about the conversation in New Hampshire, but because of the state's availability of ARPA funds, there's a lot of conversation now, especially about rural capacity, rural municipal capacity, because I think we're having both a recognition and reckoning about the ability of communities to actually absorb funding and to put the groundwork in place to make the investments that they now have the opportunity to do, and which will probably not happen again for generations. And so I think it's also a cautionary tale of the importance of having planning ready so that you can take advantage of whatever opportunities might arise. And this is really a conversation about, I think, governance capacity, period, especially I know Vermont infinitely better than I know New Hampshire, but here I think we're definitely kind of having a realization about, sorry, I just realized my video was off, having a realization about what the limits are to be able to do all this work.
Thanks for adding that insight. Appreciate it. So if that's sort of our regulatory, planning kind of stick framework, I just wanted to touch really quickly on some of the things we do in the carrot realm, some of the incentives that we have to try and encourage good sort of land use and community planning, and sort of encourage the different entities that do planning to do it in a way that meets our land use goals. So one of the core things that my division does is we administer something, we call it the designation program. There are 5 of them. I don't need to go into them in detail, but essentially what they are is rewards. If communities are doing good planning work, they are then eligible for different benefits like tax credits, streamlined permitting of new housing, access to funds for active transportation projects, priority consideration for other types of grants. And it's been, I think it's a fairly successful program. We also offer grants and technical support to do that planning work. So we have a municipal planning grants, and again, it's just some funds so that communities can do good planning work, whether it's comprehensive plans or whether it's a capital improvement plan or recreation access plan. We provide some funds for that, and also funds to modernize zoning and bylaws. And the 2 programs work pretty well together in the sense that, oftentimes if communities are getting funds to do that planning work, then they're also kind of in the pipeline to then also be able to get a designation status that opens them up to some of those benefits. So that's kind of our land use and planning in theory. So what is our development pattern looking like in practice? So it's not always smart. We're still seeing some land use and development patterns that aren't necessarily in our designated centers. They're not smart growth patterns. I think sometimes the state and local land use protections, while they are, as I mentioned, well-intentioned, they sometimes have the effect of incentivizing development in greenfields as opposed to in, infill development in some of the already developed areas. So I think we know that there's a benefit to channeling this development into our traditional centers, as I mentioned earlier, but it can tend to be sometimes more expensive than building in a greenfield. There can be increased land costs if there's an area that's pretty well developed. If there's contaminated soils, that can drive up the cost of doing something in an infill space. So I just wanted to, I guess, generally make the point that when we talk about the costs and the benefits, who and how those costs and benefits accrue to is sort of mismatched in a way that we end up not seeing the kind of development pattern that we actually would like to see. Our development patterns that we're seeing, it's also not necessarily oriented towards growth. We know that housing development has not kept up with the demand, both in terms of the total number of homes, but also the diversity of homes that's needed to meet shifts in our demographics. And that's for existing Vermonters, but also, as we were mentioning, this is also just adding additional pressure when folks are looking to move and come here. I think the only point I really wanted to make in addition to this, so we've done, a housing needs assessment, and we're just way off the mark in terms of how many homes we need versus how many we're able to build annually. One point I also wanted to make really quickly is that I know in the housing world, it seems that short-term rentals seem to be the scapegoat for this issue. And we've really been trying to kind of hone in on the idea that, short-term rentals, the tourism use of, housing for tourism part of our industry is certainly problematic, and certainly in hyper-localized spaces really a problem, but it's not the thing that's going to solve our housing crisis. And so the more we focus on that, the less we're focusing on the things that actually could help to solve our housing crisis. One other just related challenge to building in our historic centers is that our historic centers, as was already mentioned earlier today, are typically along river corridors. This makes them more susceptible to flooding. Flooding occurs almost every year. And it's just one way in which our historic centers and that sort of historic pattern of development doesn't necessarily serve us moving forward. And so it's a challenge of balancing being able to invest and build in our historic settlements, but in a way that doesn't put individual properties more at risk of these floods. It's been talked about, and I'm more curious to hear how that conversation unfolds from here. Last few slides, just quickly to go over some of the things that we're doing to try and address some of the ways in which what we're seeing on the ground does not match our planning theory. The first thing we're working on, obviously, is legislation. We know that some of the zoning practices that have been adopted in some municipalities are exclusionary. They, favor single-family homes on an acre worth of land, and not only does that drive up the cost of housing, but it also means that we're eating into land that, maybe agricultural land or wildlands that we really want to be able to protect and preserve. So we're addressing that. We're sort of in process right now. The details may not be necessary, but essentially we're trying to make it so that municipalities have to allow by right a certain amount of density of housing if it's served by existing water and sewer. Also looking at things like parking requirements, making it so that municipalities can't require more than one parking space per unit. It can still happen. Someone could still develop and choose to develop it, but it can't be required by the municipality. And that has some strong ties to just general transportation planning. If we have density of housing units and uses, if we have less space that's taken up by parking, then we can better support the kinds of transportation infrastructure that supports transportation modes other than single occupancy vehicle travel. We're also looking to just, consistent information and mapping for the purpose of doing statewide, or even, as Chris was mentioning, regional planning, just understanding where our wastewater systems are. It seems like an obvious one, but it's just, when everybody's doing their own patchwork thing, it's very difficult to aggregate that information and sort of compare across a larger geographic area. So we're focused on trying to get some of this mapping done in a more consistent way across the state. Our incentive programs can certainly be adjusted to try and help address some of the mismatch between costs and benefits and who gets to bear those or benefit from those things. Our designation program, like I said, it's been fairly successful, but it's also a really small total land area of Vermont. It's only 1/400th of the total land area in Vermont. So while there is certainly still some room for infill development in those designated areas, there's certainly also room to consider expanding the designated areas and rejiggering what the incentives are and how we allow for planning in additional space. And I think the last thing to mention is investing in housing. So we have a program, it's called the Vermont Housing Improvement Program. And so we're essentially incentivizing the rehabilitation of existing housing, offering grants of $50,000 to turn vacant units into habitable units. And the agreement there is that if you receive these funds to rehabilitate a space, then that unit is rented out at HUD fair market value for the next 5 years. So making sure that we're using our existing housing and not letting it fall into disrepair. Vermont has really old housing stock. I think 25% of it was built before 1940. And I think less than 1% of it was built after 2014 or 15. So, we have an old housing stock that needs to be reinvested in and maintained. We're also working on a program, I think we're calling it the Neighborhood Development Partnership right now, but it's essentially looking at what can we accomplish if we're really trying to coordinate investment in new neighborhood development. So if we're bringing together the folks that have money to spend on housing investment, if we're bringing together the folks that have money to spend on water and wastewater systems, transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, if we're pulling all of that together, all the infrastructure and all the things that we need to build the kind of communities we want to see, how much further can we get if we're coordinating that in advance? Are we able to better achieve our land use goals if we're doing that? Are we able to better leverage private funding if we're able to do that coordination? So that's just one of the projects I wanted to highlight that we're undertaking to try and address some of these issues. So with that, my table is probably not completely set. I'm sure there's a lot of things that we're talking about that were in that presentation, but wanted to pass it off now to, I guess, passing it to Ben Frost.
Thanks, Bronwyn. This has been so much fun to listen to, and it's really gratifying to me to be back with the CRJC. I know Jason Rasmussen is here, and he and I worked together decades ago at Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission. So I'm going to talk in a presentation that is complementary to what Bronwyn just did regarding Vermont from a New Hampshire perspective. And just to point out a couple things, I work at New Hampshire Housing. I'm the deputy director there. We're not a state agency. We're a public corporation created by state statute to do this mission here, promote, finance, and support housing solutions. In our 40-year history, we've helped about 50,000 people in families in New Hampshire buy their own homes and financed construction of 16,000 housing units, and we provide direct tenant assistance. We receive no operational funding from the state. We have an independent board of directors appointed by governor and council. We also do a lot of research and planning and advocacy work, and that's part of my realm at New Hampshire Housing. And so that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. But really I want to talk a bit about the market, and there was a question about New Hampshire population trends, and I'll get to that. But looking at the rental market and the ownership market, things are tough all over. You could take this graph. This is based on the New Hampshire Housing's residential rental cost survey that we do every year. We survey about 12,000 units statewide to come up with a really robust profile of the rental market. You could extend this graph back to 1995 and see that since that time, there's been an inexorable trend upward in the cost of rents, whether it's for 2-bedroom or for all units statewide. And you see kind of an acceleration in this curve starting in 2020 with the advent of COVID and the increased pressures on the housing market. A flip side of this is the vacancy rate. It's shockingly low. Statewide in New Hampshire, 0.5%, 0.5% vacancy rate in the rental market for all units statewide. And it is tough all over. You look at every county in the state, and every county in the state has a vacancy rate that is below what we consider to be the turnover rate. Forget about a balanced rental market, which is about 5% vacancy rate. The turnover rate is the amount of time it takes for a landlord to prep a unit for a new tenant. We've been below that for the past 7 or 8 years. And even in Coos County, the lower economic performing counties, they're still really suffering. On the purchase side, if you talk to any realtor, they're going to tell you we have nothing to sell. There's no inventory. There's nothing available on the market. My town, I live in Warner, New Hampshire. It's a population of about 2,900. And I checked this morning. There are 3 properties for sale in Warner. One of which has a buy-as-is house, needs a lot of work. Another is a manufactured housing unit built in 1986, needs a lot of work. And the other one is a cape under contract, so you're too late. So there's really not much there in Warner or across the board in New Hampshire. We regard again, a balanced market on the ownership side to be 6 months of listings, and we've been well below that for a long time. And this, of course, has a really dire impact on the lower end of the market, people attempting to enter homeownership, first-time home buyers, and they can't. Because one, there's nothing to buy, and even if they could find something, it's too expensive for them, or they're being outbid by cash buyers. And so they stay in rental units, which puts added pressure on the rental market. the price factor of this, of course, high demand, low supply, price goes up. And you can see the acceleration of this curve also with the advent of COVID. But it's been going up for a number of years. And in fact, during, you look at December 2019, compare that with the December 2022. So post COVID, the prices have gone up. This is the median sale price. This is the actual contract price. Has gone up almost 50%. Great if you already own a home. It's really crappy if you don't and you're trying to buy. And if you own a home and you want to sell, awesome, but you have to have a place to move to, and that's also a problem. This is a story that we keep hearing over and over and over again. This is from 3 days ago, WMUR. Realtors warn of a competitive housing market as more out-of-state buyers flock to New Hampshire. Now, more, I would ask, more in comparison to what? And what exactly is a flock? Well, where are New Hampshire's home buyers coming from? Most of them are coming from New Hampshire. They're not coming from Massachusetts. They're not coming from California. They're not coming from Florida. They're not coming from New Jersey, New York, or Arizona. Most of them are coming from New Hampshire. In fact, most buyers in New Hampshire are local to their own markets. That is, they're buying in the same communities or in the same general housing market. You could look at labor market areas or counties, and most people are buying local to where they're already living. Now, during COVID, there was a modest uptick in purchases from out-of-state buyers. And you see that the slight upslope there in 2020. But that seems to be correcting a bit. And most of the buyers that we see in New Hampshire are from New Hampshire. Now, this varies a lot from one part of the state to another, or from town to town. The Massachusetts border towns probably are seeing a lot more people moving in from Massachusetts, but those towns have always seen that sort of activity. But there are some, what I would characterize as attractive and repulsive factors that influence how people move and where they move. So some attractive factors, and this really gets to what Olivia was talking about earlier on, the affinity or amenity attractors. So Dartmouth College is an affinity attractor. People, alums wanting to return to the Great Green Mother when they retire, going to Hanover or the Upper Valley region generally. That's a really strong attractive factor. And in fact, Grafton County, which is where Hanover is, sees a really high proportion of, in comparison to other counties in the state, a higher proportion of buyers from other states, that is other than Massachusetts. Part of that is Dartmouth. Part of it is also the attractive factor of Dartmouth Health. It's a 7,000 employee health institution, and it attracts people from all over the country, all over the world. Other amenity factors are the mountains and lakes. So we see Carroll County and Belknap County as having a really strong attractive influence. The repulsive factor is Boston. Not that Boston's repulsive, but it pushes people away because of the cost of living, and during COVID because of fears of contamination. Now, I think Olivia made a great point. People are moving back. They're either decamping from their second homes in the Lakes region, going back to their homes in Waltham or wherever around Boston. But that attachment that they developed during COVID may make them more likely to go back to those places when the next thing hits, whatever that might be. So what are some challenges we're facing, and what do we want from our housing market? Well, here are some challenges. Supply, demand, interest rates, stuff we've been talking about and reading about in the news for a long time. The difficulty that people have in affording a home because of education debt, or affording anything to live in because of childcare costs, or in certain portions of the state, like the Mount Washington Valley or the Lakes region, because they're employed in lower wage industries, retail or hospitality. We're also looking at demographic shifts, smaller families, and an increase in single person households. And importantly, a desire to age in place. So I turned 60 yesterday. I'm a boomer. I want to age in place, which means that I'm going to stay put. I'm going to stay where I am, which means that someone is not going to be able to move into my home. And if I do decide to move to some other place, I'm going to be in direct competition with someone who is attempting to buy a home for the first time. And guess what? I've got equity. I can put down a substantial cash down payment or pay cash outright for a home and outcompete every would-be buyer who is younger than me. This is the curse that younger generations have right now because of the size of the boomer population and where they're occupying homes that would otherwise be available to them. Beyond that, local resistance to housing development or development generally, any kind of development, any change, banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. But it's particularly so with housing development. And the result is land use regulations, the perpetuation of land use regulations that are restrictive and exclusionary, whether by intention or not. Now, flipping to the relationship between housing and conservation, these are not necessarily opposing forces. We can live together in harmony, if you will. The question, though, the key is to identify what goes where, what land is really important to conserve, and what areas are appropriate for development. And this is the essence of good planning. Density can be good for both. Here's an example. This is a partnership between Easter Seals of New Hampshire and the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. Easter Seal sold 120 acres to the Forest Society, and you can see that yellow block there on the map that is in addition to the existing holdings of the Forest Society, substantially adding to it. And that allowed Easter Seals to build on the remaining 21 acres a 65-unit age-restricted property with services. So a fairly, relatively speaking, a fairly dense development that conserves a lot of land that is appropriate for conservation. And tomorrow, the Forest Society is hosting its inaugural hike on the expanded William Champlin Forest. Great story. A little more about density. So we hired Urban 3 to look at a variety of communities, and I think David Brooks from the City of Lebanon is on this call as well. Sprawl is a problem for municipalities because it's expensive. Typically, we look at land use and only think about the revenues we get from them. Well, what are the best revenues? The best revenues we get from a consumption of land standpoint are dense mixed uses. And in Lebanon, you see the top value per acre is with an office building in downtown Lebanon. Next is a mixed use development, also in downtown development. What's the worst performer? Single family homes on large lots. But you also got to look at the revenue side of things, the cost side of things. And here, Urban 3 did this analysis. In addition to looking at the tax revenues, they also looked at the municipal costs associated with different land uses. The red means it's a loser for the city. The green means they're getting a net gain. Now, if we did more development, like the stuff that is showing green, that is denser development, mixed use development, then that would allow us to, in effect, reduce our tax rates. So what's going on with building? In New Hampshire, over the long run, this is neither aspiration nor challenge. I suppose that's a challenge. The response that we had to the building boom of the 1970s, that is off the chart here, in the 1980s, the big curve on the left side of the screen gave to our municipalities a response of saying, no, we don't want any more of that. And so they adopted in the 80s and 90s substantially restrictive land use regulations that prevented have prevented since that time developers from meeting the demand that exists. So during this period, the longest economic expansion in US history, New Hampshire has been building at what amounts to recessionary building levels, consistent with how we were building in the recession of the early 90s, the recession of the early 80s. For a state that wants to expand its economy, this is not economically sustainable. So New Hampshire Housing has been looking at the housing needs of the state, and in collaboration with some of our partners came up with some of this. And I know there was a question about population projections for New Hampshire. This is historical change going back to 1970, really similar to Vermont. We see a decreasing rate of growth of population in New Hampshire. And if you look at the counties that are along the Connecticut River Valley, Cheshire County, Coos County, Grafton County, and Sullivan County, all of them in the past 10 years, that is 2010 to 2020, experienced population loss, with the exception of Grafton County, with that Upper Valley economic driver sustaining it. Looking ahead, just like that Washington Post story that Bronwyn showed of Vermont, we're expecting to peak out around 1940 and then start a slow decline in population. But we're really focused right now on the next 20 years, up through 2040, because we're expecting to see substantial growth, and we don't have the housing to support it. And that's a serious problem. What's going on here? Well, that the boomers and then the Gen Xers will at some point shed their mortal coils and move on. And you'll see that happening in increasing numbers. We're not being replaced either by babies being born or by a strong net in-migration. And in fact, in-migration has been what has been sustaining our population for the past couple decades. But we're going to start to see population decline in around 2040. So I talked a bit about the population changes and household composition changes. How much do we need right now? This housing needs analysis assessment that we hired Root Policy Research to do for us indicates that there's something on the order of 23,000 units, a gap just to meet current demand and to restore stability to the market, both on the ownership side and the renter side. Looking ahead, looking at those population projections and household composition changes through 2040, we're going to need to produce something on the order of 88,000 units. And it's both renters and owners that we need to accommodate. And that's what, we look at what we were producing in between 2010 and 2020, we are far off from that. We expect to need to produce, to accommodate new population, 60,000 housing units in this decade alone. And we're a long way from doing that. This does not account for vacation homes and short-term rentals. If we do that, add another 20,000 units over the next 20 years. It also doesn't account for climate migration or any migration. It simply doesn't account for that. This is, Olivia put it as a business as usual scenario. I think that's what we're looking at here. If there are major disruptions, then that will significantly change what we're looking at here. So what are some policy solutions? Things that we've done, I'm not going to dwell on this, workforce housing law in 2008, the accessory dwelling unit law in 2016, which has had a modest impact. And then in 2020, the enactment of the Housing Appeals Board, giving developers and property owners, anyone who has a beef with a decision that a local land use board made with regard to housing, they have now an easier means of getting an appeal heard through a tribunal. What are we doing? Right now, we have $100 million of ARPA funds going to housing production. I know it's not as much as Vermont, but it is pretty good for New Hampshire. And it includes $5 million for municipalities to change their zoning. So New Hampshire Housing is administering this on behalf of the state. We've made grants to communities to hire community navigators, and also 47 so far in the first 6 months. 47 grants totaling $2.3 million to municipalities to change their regulations, do their master plans associated with housing, not every master plan chapter, but the housing related elements of a master plan. And then other stuff going on right now in the legislature. There's a housing champion designation bill that would give the Office of Planning and Development the ability to essentially certify municipalities as being housing friendly through their regulations and make them eligible for grants for infrastructure, for per unit grants. That is, for when housing is produced, they get a $10,000 grant for every housing unit that gets produced. And there's also a grant available that would continue this municipal and planning and zoning grant program after the ARPA funds run out. There's an historic housing tax credit that's being considered and has a very good likelihood of passage. That includes also a $25 million investment in the state's affordable housing fund, and a homeownership innovations fund seeking to find ways to build new starter homes that are both affordable and energy efficient. There was, until this morning, a bill pending that would have compelled municipalities to allow fourplexes wherever single family homes are allowed. That was just killed by the House, sadly enough. Another thing that we're doing, and this is done in collaboration with St. Anselm's College Center for Ethics and Society and the Office of Planning and Development, the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas. This is an extraordinarily exciting project and an enormous project. It maps out and categorizes and catalogs every zoning district in the state. There are over 400,000 data points in this database, and this was assembled over the past 9 months by this team. And it will be made public in the next couple months as it gets launched. And it will be available for anyone to do analysis like this, looking at Manchester and its surrounding communities and the capacity to build single family homes, the potential based on what's already been developed and natural constraints. And then, well, what happens if you really want to build on a smaller lot? Well, good luck just about anywhere. Bottom line is we need to be talking more about housing, and not in a confrontational way, but in a storytelling way. Get personal, talk about your story about housing, and share it with people. We have this guide here that we published to help people engage in grassroots engagement and advocacy, and I encourage you to check that out. Climate change happens here too. It's not just California and Arizona and Florida. This is my oldest sister lived in Scituate, Mass. In 1978. She survived, but she did have the ocean in her living room. And we're likely to see more events like this along our coastline, and more events like this inland. The 2008 ice storm. This is around about where I lived at that time in Wilton, New Hampshire. As we, and I said this before, as we consider what the impacts are going to be of climate change, both here and elsewhere, we need to do better planning to account for the increased likelihood of events like this and the need to accommodate more people moving here, because this is, relatively speaking, going to be a better place to live than a lot of other places. Now I'll stop sharing.
Well, I just want to thank our panelists very much for a very informative conversation. This was intended as sort of the beginnings of a conversation. So I hope many of you can join us for the next events. Marie and I are going to try to go through some of these questions and comments real quick. Like, I know at least one of our panelists needs to leave like 10 minutes ago. So we're going to try to do this really quick. The first question was, will the recording be available? The answer is yes. And in fact, if we don't get through all of the questions and answers, we will follow up in an email to get you the recording, as well as the slides, as well as any written questions and answers. So Marie and I are going to kind of hand it off back and forth. Marie, your turn.
Okay. I'm scrolling through to try to get to a question, just a comment from a lot of consolidation of land ownership is happening in the Upper Valley. Lots of fewer dairies, and in many places, you know, especially along the Connecticut River. I think that's, you know, that's something that we're all observing as you drive around the landscape and see the development that's happening. And that led to what is the conversation in the area about water retention systems beyond traditional reservoirs, knowing that precipitation will be stronger while the groundwater recharge might be implicated with flash droughts. I can respond somewhat to that. I've given, being a watershed manager or planner for the region, you know, you think about that and what are the options that we're going to have going forward for retaining that soil moisture, making sure that we infiltrate as much as possible into the ground so that both the, you know, the recharge happens all over the landscape and not just in particular places. So when we're thinking about agriculture and we're thinking about drinking water, how do we get that increased infiltration? And I think we have to be thinking about that from all aspects, both the stormwater end of it, because most of our stormwater continues to just run off and enter rivers and streams and disappear, and that does us no good. How do we manage our agricultural landscapes to retain that water? And that's not necessarily just reservoirs, right? That's how we terrace our lands. You think about the land uses around the world and how that water is maintained on the landscape. I think we need to start broadening our view of infiltration and how we allow water to play out on the land. It's important because of the drought situation. It's also important because that added volume is going to increase the destruction of our river channels and stream channels and all those things. So I think we need to start thinking broader on how we maintain water on the land where it falls and not have it continue to run off.
Okay, so there was, I guess it's not a question. Jim Bennett was making a comment in here about there are many lessons learned over the past couple of years regarding the benefits of states having high levels of sustainable energy production versus states who rely on market-driven fossil fuels. I think that speaks for itself, but does any panelists want to elaborate on that?
One thing I'd say, Jason, is that distributed generation of power is a lot more resilient to storm events, ice storms, trees coming down on lines, than is centralized generation of power. And that, I think, with the advent of wide-scale implementation of solar, rooftop solar, backyard solar, we as a region will be in a better position.
I'll just note briefly, we actually have earmarked congressionally directed spending through Senator Sanders to collaborative agreement with Green Mountain Power to work with 6 towns, and specifically on these are towns that were identified by the Centers for Disease Control as basically being at a higher risk due to population dynamics, and also coupled with outage data. So they're of the 15 towns they identified in the state, 6 of them are in our region. So we're going to be working with the towns on the design of electricity resiliency zones. And this could be like solar, like community scale solar coupled with battery storage. In other cases, it may actually be where like you have a particularly acute situations with outages in a specific neighborhood. It may actually be in-home batteries that can charge up and at least offer some power, for a day or two while the outages get fixed. So, but we're going to be piloting this. This is somewhat new. There is a model that which is, as far as like the process, and Hanson, Vermont, that Green Mountain Power did. But that we're looking at this as another way to address electricity resilience and better in having greater grid stability and less reliance on grid challenges by having kind of more distributed power at even like neighborhood scale. I have to say, unfortunately I have to start heading south from Burlington. We're trying to get back to Townsend, Vermont ahead of this next storm system. And I unfortunately have a defroster that's not working particularly well. So this is not driving in the dark with a frozen windshield is not optimal to my resilience. So I'm going to get on the road. But thank you so much. I'm not wrapping things up, but thank you so much to all the presenters. Olivia, for just incredible work getting us organized. We've been planning this for about 3 years, I think. So thanks for getting us over the line. And thank you for everybody who has showed up and participating. It's really heartening to see the interest in this subject, and I think we can build on this from here. So thanks so much. I'm leaving, but you guys are staying. So thank you so much.
Hi, Chris. Thanks. Another comment that came in on suspecting that the population projections overlook the climate crisis because folks are ignoring it. And I think that's very true. And they're moving to vulnerable places in the South and Southwest, as pointed out earlier about human nature. And I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. I think that's very true. It's still happening, even though we know what is coming towards us.
So in the interest of time, let's move on. There's another question. Are there regional initiatives for village center housing infill? And I'd say yes, there are, at least on the Vermont side. Bronwyn talked about some of the state designation programs, which provide some tax credits and those sorts of financial incentives to do some of that. There's a whole bunch of housing funding coming through, the Vermont side. VHIP, Vermont Housing Improvement Program, and there's some others. So there's a lot of that going on. There's regulation, sort of what we call bylaw modernization. We're trying to modernize zoning to make it easier to do those sorts of things. I'm having a lot more conversations with towns about creating local housing funds or using their revolving loan funds for housing and any number of other things. Tax stabilization. Bronwyn, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to add that, Jesse, I saw that this question came from you, and if you have thoughts about how these programs are not working for you, definitely reach out. As I mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at our designation program and figuring out, is it working for folks or not, and how would it change? So, if you have observations or thoughts, please feel free to reach out.
Ben, is there anything in New Hampshire that you want to kind of talk about in terms of that?
Yeah, well, Jesse's asking from NVDA in the Northeast Kingdom. What I have to say doesn't apply there because it's New Hampshire, but RSA 79E, which is the Community Revitalization Tax Relief Incentive, is enabling the legislation for municipalities to adopt a tax relief provision for substantial rehabilitation of essentially downtown structures. That was its original incarnation in 2006, and it has been adopted by a lot of communities and utilized by a lot of property owners. And it gives limited time relief from increased taxation that's attributable to the rehabilitation. So you do the rehab, you increase the value of your property, and you don't have to pay the added taxes based on the increased valuation for 5, 7, actually up to 13 years total.
I'll jump to the next one, and the comment is, in the rush to fill the housing shortage combined with the current cost of construction, are we going to see a great deal of this housing built to bare minimum code standards, not so energy efficient, and potentially a negative feedback loop regarding the climate?
I'll just jump in really quickly with what I do know on this. Codes are an interesting space to be working in. I will say that Vermont does have an energy code that is sort of progressing towards, at least on the energy efficiency side, progressing towards net zero by 2030, 2040. So I think those codes are sort of maintaining that, you know, baseline minimum around what do we consider to be safe housing, what do we consider to be any energy efficient housing, et cetera. So I do think those codes are kind of helping to keep up and make sure that at least new housing that's going in is, you know, being built to a standard.
I think this is a really good question, and I think it depends on who's doing the building. It certainly, you know, in New Hampshire, the codes are kind of spare. The builders would argue otherwise, but if there's funding coming through, say, New Hampshire Housing, we have design and construction standards that push the developers toward net zero or passive house certification. And in fact, you can see one of those projects in West Lebanon. It's on Tracy Street, done by Twin Pines Housing Trust behind the Kilton Library. It's a passive house certified multifamily structure that we're really proud of.
I don't see any more questions. I think we're 25 minutes late, but we had a really great discussion. Thank you again to all of our speakers, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. It's been great. I hope you do join us for some of the future discussions. March 29th is the next one, the World Cafe discussion. So please join us again. And there is somewhere there's a survey. Andrea had in the chat a link to a survey. We'd love your feedback for the event today. So if you could spend a little bit of time on that, we would all greatly appreciate that. And she just added it to the chat again. Is there anything anyone else wants to say in closing? Olivia or Marie or anybody else?
No, thank you all, the presenters in particular, and you've put a lot into making all this clear and understandable to everybody. So for those of us who are non-housers, that's appreciated. Thank you. And for everybody who hung in there until 4:30.